And if everybody can find a wall or a seat to lean against or whatever, we're glad to have everybody today and glad to see the interest in this subject once again this month. So this is our fourth meeting of the Local Government Annexation Committee, and we'll start with our roll call.
Senator Nemus.
Present.
Senator Stivers. Senator Wheeler.
Here.
Senator Yates.
Present.
Representative Bridges. Representative Chester Burton.
Present.
Representative Meredith.
Yes, sir.
Representative Pollock. Representative Dixon.
Here.
Chair Mills.
I'm here, and I think Representative Bridges is here. He just maybe stepped out. All righty. We have some minutes. If we could get a motion on our minutes.
Motion.
Have a second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right. Our minutes are approved. Our sole presenter today is already in front of us, ready to rock and roll, Mr. J.D. Cheney, who is Executive Director and CEO of Kentucky League of Cities. And we'll just let Mr. Cheney take off and make his presentation. So thank you so much, J.D., for being here.
Hey, appreciate you, Chairman Mills, and can you all hear me?
Yes.
Is that all right? Okay. And Chairman Dixon, members of the committee, and this is a task force, not a committee, right? I already messed up. Brianna, sorry I went off script there. I really do appreciate the opportunity to present testimony on behalf of KLC. As Chairman Mills said, I'm J.D. Cheney. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of KLC. I've been in that role for about 4 years, but 23 years with the organization overall. I want to compliment and commend the chairs and the members on the way this task force has been conducted. This has been a fair, open, and transparent process, and KLC and our cities really do thank you for that. I've had the honor and privilege to sit at a testimony table just like this a whole lot of times over the past several years representing Kentucky's more than 400 cities. Sometimes those experiences have been fun and enjoyable as we made modifications and corrections. Other times, not so much so. They've been a little intimidating and scary. I try not to reminisce too much on those. But as many times as we've been given an opportunity like this over the past several years, this time is likely one of the most consequential given the importance of annexation to the future of our cities and the future of our entire Commonwealth. You don't just have to take my word for it. According to a 2018 article, a study cited in a 2018 article in The Economist, cities that are unable to easily expand their boundaries are poorer, more segregated, have higher concentrations of poverty, lower growth, worse municipal bond ratings, and less well-educated workforces. Today, cities find themselves in more of a defensive position than I can recall in my time in the legislative arena. But the recent surge in discussions about annexation gives cities a wonderful opportunity to foster a better understanding of the legal framework of annexation and its role in advancing Kentucky. More particularly, today gives us an opportunity to respond to things like this on the slide. Growing cities are a growing concern for counties, and that's a problem for all Kentuckians. I will admit that our city officials that were here last month were a little taken aback with the statement that growing cities were a problem for all Kentuckians. And so it shouldn't come as any surprise to you all that our response to questions and statements like this is that annexation is most certainly not a problem for all Kentuckians. And that overall, and with very few anomalies, if you look at all the annexations is also a benefit to Kentucky counties, both in terms of county finances and in terms of opportunity and the quality of life that it gives everyone's citizens. Rather, we think a much better statement would be something like this. Growing cities mean a growing Kentucky, and that's good for everyone. Annexation is not only an important tool to protect the health and stability of our hometowns that you all represent. It's one of the most important methods of advancing economic development in this state. I'm going to do my best to address most of the issues that have been raised these past few months, but you will be happy to know that due to some good advice from some staff people, I'm not going to try to respond to every single one of them. And they're making me stick reasonably to a script, so I won't sit up here for an hour and go down every rabbit hole, which is kind of unusual. But I'm going to try to do that so that way you all can get going on a Friday afternoon. We're going to do our best to hit the main points. But the first one and the most obvious that we have to acknowledge after hearing the county government presentations is that this whole issue, has much more to do with the want and need for more tax revenue by county governments. In fact, the simplest way to summarize the county testimony is that you are being asked to provide a resolution to county revenue issues by way of annexation, and perhaps to do so at the disproportionate expense of Kentucky cities. Now, maybe it's because of the adversarial nature our organizations were at the end of last session that's created a perception issue, but we also have to address a perception issue that's more prevalent up here, and that's that cities and counties don't get along with one another. I'll tell you this, the places where there exist hostile and antagonistic relationships are the exception, not the rule, by far. I cannot tell you the number of city officials, many of them here, who shared their confusion about the debate on this whole issue because of their great working relationship and understanding with their county counterparts. However, we are encouraged by the comments of KCO last month that they want to work together again, and we welcome an attempt to return to the collaborative spirit that our organizations enjoyed over the past couple of decades. We're also encouraged to hear a recognition and acknowledgement that there are so many more pressing issues facing local governments that we should be working together on in a united effort. At KLC, we have always felt that the fortune of local governments rise and fall together, and such is the case with annexation as well. Now, before I get into the substance, I don't know if Jim in here or wherever he is. There he is. I do want to share that I learned one more thing during the county testimony that we have in common from my county counterpart, Jim. Jim went to great lengths to share his respect for Ronald Reagan during the last month's testimony when he shared his favorite Ronald Reagan quote, trust but verify. I appreciate that. I really do appreciate that quote, and I agree that it's especially applicable in the context of sorting out legislative and policy decisions, including the one here on annexation. I share Jim's admiration of the former president as a child of the 80s. You know, if you can imagine back, Chairman Mills, to when I had hair, or Chairman Dixon, I tried to style it like Reagan. You know, every little picture of me in grade school and middle school, I had the little booth and everything ready to go. So, but you know, I'm not gonna claim that I can outdo Jim's superfan status when it comes to the former president. I know I can't do that. He has me beat. But I did want to say this to Jim. You know, trust but verify may be his favorite quote, but there are a whole lot of quotes I like from Reagan, and every single one of them contains something about a shining city on a hill. The first thing we need to do is put annexation in perspective. Let's look at this chart, the very first chart. You know, despite being the area where 60% of Kentucky's population reside, almost 60% of Kentucky's population resides, and where 75% of every economic transaction occurs in this state, that's all located in 3.66% of Kentucky's landmass. Listen, everybody tried to guess this number as we were talking. I said, how much do you think of Kentucky cities is incorporated and unincorporated? It's 3.66% of our landmass. It contains 60% of our residents and 75% of our economic activity. I hope you can look at this figure and see that cities aren't annexation happy. We're not engaged in some kind of modern-day municipal conquest with mayors running around haphazardly planting flags in unincorporated areas. It's just not true when you look at those figures. Nor have we been abusive about our expansion. To the contrary, Cities have generally been intentional and conservative about their growth. They are serious about evaluating the cost and benefits before they add territory. And we have relied primarily upon the grace and the guidance of property owners in determining how we evolve. That's central. That's a central theme here in Kentucky. Cities have to be judicious about expansion. We have to be judicious because not all annexations are workable. Some do not create efficiencies or achieve the economies of scale or serve the best interests of the citizens of a city. Because whenever a city enlarges, whenever it grows, it also enlarges the city's duties and responsibilities. Because it requires us to provide the city services in those newly annexed areas. Therefore, you only generally see in Kentucky annexations proceed where with landowners where there's a promise of betterment for both parties involved to put them in a better spot than they would be existing separately. Let's talk about that property owner relationship. Let's continue to put annexation into perspective. We're one too far ahead. All right. We don't do a lot of non-consensual annexations in Kentucky. Almost every bit of our growth here occurs because property owners request to be included within the city. This is because Kentucky annexation law puts their rights as a priority when you look at how our law is drafted. This is the information that's readily available on the Kentucky Secretary of State's Land Office site, but we just decided to break it down and clean it up a little bit. Some of them were corrective filings, and when you take those out, between 2016 and 2022, 92% of all annexations were done at the property owner's request. 92%. And then you can see there in that little gray tab, the little bitty amount. On average, out of those 77 annexations each year, only 6 were non-consensual. Property owners drive annexation. And in placing property owners' rights as a top priority under Kentucky law, it makes non-consensual annexation a much, much more difficult process. If we don't have the written consent of every property owner of record, you cannot complete a consensual annexation. And then if you are going to go forward, the city's going to go forward, that requires a multi-step complicated process that requires the passage of 2 separate ordinances, a 60-day waiting period between the passage of the 2 ordinances. And just to clarify from last month, property owners and residents do have the right to exercise a right to petition and have the annexation placed on the ballot if they present that petition during the 60-day waiting period. There may be a variety of reasons that property owners want to be part of the city. To receive city utility services is one of the most common ones, but also public safety, police, and fire. Sale of alcoholic beverages, as you saw, we hear that a lot. Not a whole lot, but it's one of the reasons. Quality of city streets, proximity to retail, recreation, and other amenities that cities have to offer. Don't underestimate the role of zoning, planning and zoning. A lot of our counties haven't adopted planning and zoning. So sometimes property owners want to have a lot more certainty about what's going to happen in the neighboring areas with their property. So what do? They ask the city to annex them. But regardless of the reasons and the motivation for property owners to be part of the city, I think it's important that the legislature keep in mind Kentucky law recognizes that our landowners have the right to put their property to its highest and best use. And that, I would submit respectfully, is a principle that we shouldn't even partially abandon. This is a lot of talking. I'm sorry. You know, I love Kentucky cities probably more than anyone. I really honestly do. But what attracts me to them is not their shapely curves. Cities don't have beautiful boundaries. In fact, city boundaries are pretty ugly. As you all could see on display last month in that city body shaming book that Keiko gave out. You'll be relieved to know that it didn't hurt our feelings or make Kentucky cities feel self-conscious about their border appearances, because they understand that they're not any uglier than other cities across the entire country. When it comes to city limits, guys and gals, ugly is normal. Ugly is normal. So from sea to shining sea, west coast, east coast, red states, blue states, perfectly square states, and all the bordering states around Kentucky, cities, because of their nature, have some interesting boundary shapes. Now, I can tell by the looks on every one of your faces, you wouldn't rather be anywhere but right here, Frankfort, Kentucky, Friday afternoon, listening to an annexation presentation, and this is where you would prefer to be. But if you'd humor me for just a little while, just a little bit of levity, I'd really like us to take a trip across the country and have a look at some of Kentucky, the United States' fastest growing cities, both in terms of population and in terms of GDP and the increase in their GDP. And I think you're going to see cities pay attention, because we're looking pretty good compared to some of these folks. Let's go to the Pacific Northwest first, to Vancouver. This is kind of like a cloud. You kind of want to set up and look at it and see what that's going to be. But there's juts, corridors, shoestrings, tentacles, whatever you want to call it. It's not a beauty. But you go on down the coast to San Jose, America's 10th largest city. That's a real beauty there in and of itself. It's the 10th largest city. It's Silicon Valley. Has 2,500 tech companies. It has 90,000 tech-related jobs. It is booming in San Jose, and its looks seem to not be an issue. It may be booming because it's able to grow. If we head on down to Austin, Texas, everybody loves to talk about Austin. It is the fastest growing country. It's kind of a country on its own. The fastest growing city in the country in terms of population and its economy. And you see how it looks. It's got flags. It's got warts on it, things of that nature that would probably slow you down a little bit. Saddle up and let's go to Colorado. Speaking of square states, there's a square state that has its full share of municipal boundaries that are just as ugly here as Aurora, Colorado. Sometimes it doesn't connect. I guess they don't have a contiguity requirement there. They don't connect. They got flags. It's a beauty as well. Getting a little close to home, Representative Bridges, let's go down to Cape Girardeau, Missouri. That's just, I think, probably about a 40-minute ride from Wickliffe, I believe. In Cape Girardeau, they got a lot of corridor annexation going there, a lot of areas. But that's one of the cities in the country that has had a 7% GDP growth just between 20 and 21. We don't want to leave our neighbors to the north out, so if you're a Notre Dame fan, you might go to South Bend. It maybe has a flag on top of it, kind of waving and saying, just like a lot of Kentucky cities, here I am, come to South Bend. Don't want to leave out Ohio either. Look at Columbus. Look at all those pockets. Look at all those things. That's a common thing you see. 15.1% population growth in Columbus, Ohio, over the past decade. And it's really important that as Columbus, as quick as it's growing, their state experts say that's in part, they acknowledge that it's in part to the fact that Columbus can add additional land to its territory. If you don't want to stick around too much in Ohio, let's go to Rocky Top, even though I know that's going to be hard for some of my people back here, but let's go to Knoxville. Rocky Top's a little rocky. That probably has more fingers and corridors, and just take a good look at Knoxville, because it's no different than a lot of other Kentucky cities or other cities around the state. 19.2 increase in median personal income just between 2021 and 2022. What do we aspire to be? Do we want to stop the growth? If you want to stick in the Southeastern Conference, let's just go on down to Birmingham, Alabama. Now, I don't even think a full case of beer is going to make this one look good. That wasn't in the script. I'm probably in trouble for that. I guess I'll get talked to later. Listen, this is an outlier for the state of Alabama. Alabama's economy's been declining, but not in Birmingham. Birmingham, it continues to grow. A couple more cities, just so we get a full-on trip. Here's Savannah, Georgia. We all know about Savannah. We know it has tremendous GDP growth, 13.8% between 2020 and 2021. Median personal income, 1 year, up 6.9%. Now listen, I don't know what you were saying, Senator Wheeler, but if you think it's water, look it up, because it's not water. I thought, sure, this was going to be water. It's not. It's not because of water. This is Savannah without the water separation. And in Raleigh, North Carolina, it seems like our local chambers of commerce have taken more trips to Raleigh, North Carolina, so we could be more like Raleigh, North Carolina. But let's look at what it looks like. Right in the triangle of North Carolina, tremendous growth. We know what's happening in that triangle. And under North Carolina's annexation laws, they're no different. Lots of pockets, lots of parts to Raleigh. And we just thought it'd be a little more fun than when we went to Southern Legislative Conference back in the summer when it was 100 degrees to take an October trip to Charleston, South Carolina. And if you look at Charleston, it also doesn't yield great results. Some of those are islands, but a lot of that is on the land mass. So the point of all this, just a moment of levity to look at other cities, but really to make a serious comparison, is that city governments, no matter where they are, they're not static political subdivisions. City governments are living, breathing creatures that flow along and change where the masses of people are, where utilities can be run, where transportation corridors can be constructed. They don't have static and unchanging boundaries. That's just not their nature anywhere in the country. There are a whole lot of factors that contribute to the shape, and I know I'm spending a lot of time on shape, but we've spent a lot of time on shape up until this point. Historic boundaries kind of define where it goes. Merger of neighborhoods may contribute to the way a city looks. Topography and geography, think about natural boundaries like rivers, lakes, mountains, streams, other types of landscape constraints. Determine what's developable. I think Representative Meredith cited the fact that you can't develop a river bottom if you're going along the river. So those things make a determination on how the city looks. But economic factors, suitability for those lines, streets, how they can be developed, all factor in. But I want to tell you, most importantly, and what I think is most reflected in Kentucky, it's the fact that property owners have the controlling interest in the way that their property is going to be used. And they make the decisions about whether or not they're going to be part of the city. There's a lot of talk about shoestring, tentacle annexation, strip annexation, kind of pejorative terms, but Kentucky law isn't any different than a whole lot of other states you just looked at in allowing corridor annexations. I want to be clear about what the law in Kentucky is on corridor annexation, the strips that you saw, just like you saw in other states. In Kentucky, it's really important that you understand that our law does not permit the annexation of a barren strip of land just for the purposes of providing contiguity. Let me say that again. We cannot just create a shoestring, a tentacle, whatever you want to call it, in order to provide contiguity. Instead, under Kentucky law, there has to be a concrete and tangible municipal purpose that exists at the time the annexations commenced. Not one day there might be. It has to exist at the time the annexation is commenced. And so that would be something like utility lines or other things of that nature. Let me summarize on this shape thing. Maybe it seems like we were hurt more than we were. I don't know. But if you just look at the map of city boundaries, it's never going to paint the complete picture. I promise you this. There's a story that goes along with every pocket, peninsula, zigzag, and line that you see on the map. There's a story that goes with it. And the shape of cities should always be analyzed in the context of those stories. If you take the time to listen to them, I promise you this, you're going to find at the beginning and the end of those stories, in most cases, it's about the property owner. And I did have a few cities reach out that wanted me to give them a shout out. And let me just tell you, Hopkinsville, I mean, it didn't look all that pretty when it was presented. But you need to know that was Walmart. Came along, said we need utilities, we need a fire station down here. City of Hopkinsville obliged and ran the utility lines to support that construction and that development. Poor Prestonsburg has been through the ringer, but listen, these annexations occurred many years ago. One of them was jointly with the county for an opportunity at Thunder Ridge Horse Track. They wanted to be annexed. That's now a shared opportunity zone with the city and county in that area, both of them working together. And US 23, that was a pretty ugly part of Prestonsburg boundary, but US 23, that's one of the most dangerous highways in the state. And guess who works all the accidents that occurs there? That road contains the utility infrastructure of the city of Prestonsburg, and they work multiple accidents. And then one of my favorites in response to Prestonsburg, and I'll tell you why. Because I thought there was no way they could explain that really long tentacle. And they did. They did. That is the Prestonsburg Passage Trail. That is an 8.5-mile rail trail project that's owned and maintained by the city and that all of the citizens in that region enjoy. They put the infrastructure in. Everybody has it. It's a rail trail grant and development from the city of Prestonsburg. So the moral of the story is maybe don't be so quick to judge a book by its cover. Look at the stories about why cities have the shape that they have and realize that it's property owners that mainly drive it. All right. I made an assertion when I started this presentation that most annexations provide financial and other benefits to counties, even in counties where occupational license taxes do not stack. Usually, when cities annex undeveloped land and make investments in infrastructure, such as utilities and streets to make it suitable for development of residential, retail, or industry, those investments are many times solely made by the city. Sometimes they spend hundreds of millions of dollars for the property to be developed or site ready. When the property is developed, in many cases, it generally comes with big increases in assessed values. For property tax purposes, that gives the county increased property tax receipts with no investment and no sharing of cost. You know, I went to law school because math wasn't my best class. So sometimes I got to kind of dumb things down to understand math issues. And I think it's easy to look at kind of a hypothetical example of what this means for a Kentucky county. Then we'll look at some real examples. Just assume we're not to that one yet. It's kind of unveiling the big surprise. Looking at a hypothetical county that imposes property tax, of course, insurance premium tax, and occupational tax that credits. Let's take a 100-acre parcel, $1 million of value, PVA assessed value, has a small home, small farm operation where the county's 7% insurance premium tax produces $210. So you got $1,000 in property, $210 in insurance premium tax. And let's say this small farm does better than a lot of small farms and generates $50,000 in net profits and $100,000 in wages. The county prior to the annexation of this, is collecting $2,710. Now the next slide. Gentleman farmer says, you know what? I can make a little money off of it. Let me go to the city. We got a developer who's interested in developing my 100 acres. It sells through the annexation. The city makes investments in streets, roads, residential, industrial, whatever else, makes investments. And let's just conservatively say, and you're going to realize this is conservative when you look at some of the real examples, that it increases the assessed value once it's fully developed to $5 million. Now, what's that mean for the county government finances? They're going to collect $5,000 in property taxes. They may lose their ability to collect the occupational tax and the $210 in the insurance premium tax they were collecting. If there was even that level of economic activity occurring. And at the end of the day, they come out ahead $2,290 due to the investment of the city, even if they didn't participate in that. So looking at the impact of property taxes is really important. Just a few real-life examples instead of hypotheticals. If you kind of understand that math, you'll understand what it means if we look at Burr Rock Development, Representative Meredith down in Bowling Green. That's a residential development, requested annexation by the city. Started out 22.6 acres, had a total tax base of $1.1 million. Now, following the annexation and development, has an average lot price of $95,000 each lot. Home values on the 17 that have been constructed so far, $418,000. The tax base is already up to $10.4 million. It's a 10-time flip on the value of the property once that investment's made. Just like the hypothetical example. That adds to the county tax base on its property taxes. One more in Bowling Green, just for the heck of it, because this one's kind of dramatic. This is a hub. This is a multi-use development there. It has several parts to it. We tried to kind of simplify it down, but there's a lot of moving parts. The hotel part was about $1 million. Now, after the annexation and the development, $24.8 million. The multi-home unit went from the parcels related to it from $4 million to $75 million. That's a big increase. Two other pieces of property went from $3.2 to about $13 million as a result of the improvement. Now listen to this. This is a 1,280% increase in the tax base. The city did the investment. They worked the utilities, they worked the police, they worked the fire, they worked those issues. So counties are getting a financial benefit. Let's look at Elizabethtown, just in a holistic. They did their due diligence and said we've done 29 annexations in 10 years. 1,400 acres. They went from all of those acres from a $22.5 million assessed value to a $71.3 million. Net gain of $48.8 million in the property tax base. And I didn't have a slide for it, but I did hear from Owensboro yesterday. They looked at their 58 most recent annexations where they provided some incentive to the developers, which frequently happens. The city governments don't just all of a sudden get to collect the taxes. They're pledging their occupational taxes. They're pledging other things. Has a pre-annexation value of $7.9 million. Post-annexation value on those 59 annexations, $617 million. Over the past decade, the incremental county revenue on those annexations, $6.8 million that the city estimates that they've been receiving. So as we consider any effort to expand the stacking of taxes by counties on city taxpayers, we also need to consider the perspective of the taxpayer and the services that they're receiving from each unit of government. Regardless of the county, all 120 counties, regardless of the county, all city taxpayers also pay county property taxes. Property taxes are the great equalizer in all counties, and they ensure that all residents are paying the same for the base county services that everybody receives. But there are some counties that, for whatever reason, have not used the property tax tools available to them because they've lowered their property taxes below the compensating tax rate or failed to use the 4% revenue increase provision and have fallen so far behind that they couldn't possibly catch up under Kentucky law. And for many, It's not their fault. So, but looking at it in a 1 year to 1 year period, if you understand the compensating tax rate calculation, it seems difficult to say that taking that 4% may not produce a significant amount of revenue in any single year by itself, but the compounding effect makes a big difference in a relatively short period of time. So before I go to the next slides, let me just preface it by acknowledging that there are different political realities everywhere. There may be other constraints that may affect the decisions that some of these counties made in the following examples. And we support local decision making for us and for the counties. So let's just look at a couple of counties and the effect of their decisions to either lower property taxes or otherwise not use the tools available to them. The first one is Davis County. Davis County's actively lowered its property taxes over a period of time, tripled in the past 5 years their occupational taxes, but lowered their property taxes that's collected within the city limits again. So we're kind of shifting from a property tax to a productivity-based tax here. And I don't know the reason behind that, but you can look at the math of what occurs if the county had adopted their 4%, which isn't subject to rollback or recall. They could have adopted 4% revenue growth and adopted a rate to equal that. And it produced, if you look at the time period, in just a short period of time, that left $2.1 million on the table. It's really important to look at that 2022 line. Because of not taking their 4%, $649,000 less in revenue that they did not collect. It's unrealized and it's lost, and once you don't do it, you can't get it back. Same case for Madison County. That's my home county. I have some familiarity with that. This is a county that actually did take their 4%, and they tried to even go above 4%, but got rejected by the county residents. And so they did take 4% in 2018. They did that. But not taking the 4% every year in this 5-year period, it's $904,000 they've left on the table. Again, in the last chart, if they had done that in 2022, they would have collected $374,000 more dollars. This is just 5 years. Mm-hmm. We didn't get the data, the information to go back a longer period of time, but I can tell you anecdotally in Madison County, I'm a resident of Richmond, that we had a magistrate who I think holds the record for the longest serving magistrate in Kentucky history. He's God rest his soul, he's dead, but his biggest prideful thing that he boasted around the county was, we haven't taken above the compensating tax rate in my entire 30 years of service. And that probably accounts for why Madison County just this year adopted a 7.1 cent per hundred property tax rate. Far afield from Bowling Green or Warren County, which maintained a 14.5 because it fit in the compensating tax rate. Those things have an impact. And I'm not bringing them up, nor are our cities wanting to bring them up to condemn or cast any aspersions on local decision making. That's a cornerstone of our organization. We support it for the counties as well. But we have to, because it's really difficult for us to contemplate efforts to take away city revenues that are essential in providing services in newly annexed areas or currently in the city that enable us to make investments that spur growth and development. With these examples out there of counties that lower taxes or otherwise don't take their 4%. We recognize it's a hard vote, and I'm not living in a glass house. We have cities that don't take the vote on the property tax. So I'm not trying to throw stones. It's a hard vote, but a lot of cities have taken hard votes over the years, not just on property taxes, but other types of taxes, because they know it has to be done, and it's what was required to ensure that we can deliver on being the economic engines of this state. I want to say more on this in the recommendations section. You'll be happy to know we got some actual thoughts about how we can resolve this going forward. So we got a few ideas that I've talked over with our members and board members and officers. And I think Representative Meredith would be disappointed if I didn't bring up the first one, because we've been beating this drum. I've been beating this drum for 23 years at the League of Cities, that something's got to change with Kentucky's constitutional provision. We've presented on it multiple times. We've spent years advocating for passage of a constitutional amendment that would provide revenue diversification and flexibility for local governments. We've always believed that that holds a promise of reducing the competitive nature of the current local government tax structure. We're hemmed in with 1891 and 1901 language with the Constitution. It holds a lot of promise. You know, I had a staffer at the League that probably summed up the way the Constitution works right now. Our constitutional provision, 181, kind of forces you all to starve your children and then throw out a breadcrumb every now and then and expect us not to fight. And that's the way it's working. We also are watching, as a second point, with great interest, the task force that runs concurrently with this one during this interim focused on jail reform. We know that's been talked about for 40 years as well, if not longer. But we know that if the General Assembly and counties can make some reforms, whatever they might be, to address the financial pressures that come with the operation of the jails on behalf of the state of Kentucky, that could lead to a whole lot of relief and a whole lot of reduction in competition. Now, while those suggestions, I think they're legitimate. I think they might be a panacea. In fact, even though we usually say there's no such thing, those two things would really make a huge difference. But now, I've heard you all, Chairman, I've heard you all, members of the task force and members of the legislature, that you all have a clear expectation that KLC and KCO work to reach a resolution on this bill through an annexation bill. And in consulting with their cities, we have a few concepts directly related to annexation, apart from these two. Even if we did these two, we may not have to talk about this other part. But if they don't happen, let's give local governments, whether they be city or county, that's lost significant ground on property taxes over the last several years because of previous governance decisions made by others, even made by themselves. If they've lost significant ground because of those decisions related to House Bill 44 and property taxes, let's give them a window that would allow over time the adjustments of property tax rates outside of the House Bill 44 recall limitations. They can make up for that over a short period of time. And remember, property taxes are the great equalizer, right? Cities and counties, it's all uniform throughout the entire, and it's collected in the city limits. We also think it's worthwhile to explore very carefully, though, I'm going to be careful about this one, adopt a hold harmless calculation to be applied upon annexation to ensure what I'm telling you is true, that there's not any displacement of county revenue when an annexation occurs. Any formula would need to factor in any revenue the county was collecting from occupational taxes or insurance premium taxes at the time of the annexation, but that would need to be offset by the property tax increases that we just talked about in those places. This would also, this really would have to be carefully crafted so we're sure it didn't disincentivize growth. And while much greater deliberation on taxpayer fairness would be needed in analyzing the wisdom of a multi-million-dollar tax increase by allowing massive changes to permit wholesale stacking of taxes, and also acknowledging that our cities are opposed to any kind of revenue sharing that doesn't have cost sharing associated with it, we do think it would be worthwhile to travel down the road of exploring a limited exception to 68-197-7. Now, that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to y'all, but that's the crediting provision in Kentucky state law. To provide a limited exception to required crediting in newly annexed areas if the city and county could agree on county participation on the investment side. We're anxious to discuss that with our county counterparts. You know, Kentucky's tradition, I belabored it, we have a tradition of property owner rights here. We think we should continue to strengthen it. We want to suggest that we strengthen property owners' rights to provide an additional threshold in the non-consensual annexation provisions that would say annexation's over. It doesn't require a vote. You've hit a certain threshold of property owners petitioning. It's done. It's over. It stops there and doesn't have to go to the ballot. Now, that may take away some of these funnier stories that we have at time with hospitals putting people, janitors in the basement, living and pulling in trailers, or buying Lowe's sheds and putting a mailbox in front of them and calling them houses so people could vote. But while those theatrics are fun, we think it's time to just put our money where our mouth is on property owner rights. Two more things on suggestions. Amend the statute of limitations for bringing legal challenges to reduce the time for filing. That's 2 years right now. From a developer's perspective, that's a long time with uncertainty. And I think in exchange for reducing that filing period, we would definitely be open to considering some changes for statutory standing for people to challenge annexations. I told you before, Kentucky law doesn't allow the annexation of barren strips of land. This would help enforce that rule with more people or more parties had standing to challenge. And I'm disappointed President Stivers isn't here because I thought he would love this one. I knew we agreed on this. Now that the annexation lawsuits are over down in the southern part of Kentucky between a couple of cities, we do need to clarify the statute, which clarifies city ownership of utility infrastructure also means ownership of utility infrastructure that's operated by any agency that's created by a city. President Stivers referenced the sometimes city v. city issues. That's the only place we knew it was going on, and it was over that statute. But now that it's been resolved and we don't have pending litigation, we have an opportunity to correct it. So now, Chairman and members of the task force, in the time between today and the next task force meeting on the 17th, it's our hope that we can work with our county counterparts to develop agreed-upon reasonable recommendations. Not only because you all expect it of us, but because it's in the best interest of all local governments to resolve this conflict ourselves. We can call this, in conclusion, an annexation issue if you want to, but the truth is this is a revenue issue in a few counties that is ultimately the result of statutory constructs created by previous General Assemblies, so I'm not trying to hurl the blame at you all sitting in these seats. As the legislature considers the issue, it should be fully informed about how policy changes can impact Kentucky's growth and competitiveness, how it impacts the stability of our hometowns, and also examine the issue based on fairness to taxpayers by understanding the true extent of the impact on county finances and services when cities and property owners decide to partner to annex. I want to say that last bit one more time. When cities and property owners decide to partner to annex territory, that is 92% of the time in the Commonwealth of Kentucky over the last 6 years. And yes, we did have to admit that our city limits are not very pretty, as hard as it was. But our cities pack a mighty economic punch for our Commonwealth in a little bit of area, 3.66% of the landmass, to be precise. And these are the areas with 60% of our population and 75% of our economic activity. One of CAECO's recommendations was make annexation make sense. I have to counter. Annexation does make sense. Annexation makes sense from a procedural standpoint to the city governments, which must take all those complicated steps. One little error voids the annexation. We're not a substantial compliance, it's strict compliance. Annexation makes sense from the standpoint of property owners that have the ability to exercise their rights to seek out and implement the highest and best use of their properties. Annexation also makes sense for the people of Kentucky, to our citizens that enjoy the opportunities for jobs, residential housing, and all the amenities and services that cities offer to enhance our quality of life in this state. And that's regardless of where a person lives or works. And in most cases, if you take the time to do some annexation math, it makes sense for counties too. even those handful of counties that are impacted by occupational license tax crediting, and even those that have not fully utilized the property tax tools available to them. The bottom line is that annexation is critical to ensure Kentucky continues to grow. Kentucky cities drive progress and prosperity, and they shouldn't be stifled as they do what they do best and what they were designed to do, creating that higher quality of life that's necessary for us to compete as we seek to draw jobs, we seek to draw people, and opportunity to this state. Growing cities are a growing Kentucky, and that's good for everyone. Let's keep it that way. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, JD. Take
Sorry
you a drink.
about that, Chairman. That was
No,
way
no,
longer than we timed it.
Take you a drink and of water, and
Not a case of beer, huh?
that's right. We got a couple questions. Senator Wheeler's got a question.
JD, thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. I guess a couple questions I would have. I mean, clearly you gave us a lot of examples of cities that were rather oddly shaped like that across the country. Do those states where you put those cities as indicators, do they have identical annexation laws to the Commonwealth of Kentucky, or do they require some type of county input in some of those states?
No, all 50 states are different.
Yeah.
Senator Wheeler, on their annexation law. It's uniquely a state structure. So what each one of them did, I'm not for sure of. Most of them allow corridor annexation. Some of them may allow some notification to the county, but I can tell you explicitly that we're not going to be supportive, most likely, of anything that requires us to get permission from a county in order to be able to annex territory.
And the point, I understand that. I guess the point I was just trying to make, it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison. It was just a demonstrative example for the presentation. Is that a fair statement?
No, I don't think that's necessarily a fair statement, because I think the point of that was that the nature of cities are that they're not static political subdivisions. Whether it's geography factors, whether it's factors related to neighborhoods, whether it allows corridor annexations, whether they value the property owner's rights or allow non-consensual annexations, I think that's the nature of city governments. They change. They don't stay static, and they're really not pretty. You can have a pretty good time looking at all these cities around the states. They're just not what we typically think of when you think of state boundaries or county boundaries.
And I get that.
I'm
just the point I'm trying to make
Yep.
is that we don't know all the political considerations that went into the shapes that you put up on the screen.
No, you do not.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that I would just want to ask about, I know that I think President Stivers brought this up at the last meeting. What do you have any knowledge? I mean, as far as the rational basis for the 30,000 figure, as to why cities and counties are subject to different rules and different places, and is there a rational basis for that in your opinion?
Oh, you're really gonna put me on the spot, Senator Wheeler. I anticipated this, so I got the case site for you. It's 27 Southwest 3rd 790. It's Preston versus Johnson County Fiscal Court. There was a challenge there of it. Now, it was analyzed under equal protection analysis, but they used the rational basis test. I want to tell you what the court said. This is not the League of Cities setting in defense of this. This is actually a good court opinion for the legislature in determining legislative power without judicial intervention in it. But a legislative body is not required to articulate a purpose or rationale supporting its classification. Rather, the legislative act will be upheld if there is any reasonably conceivable state of facts that could provide a rational basis for the classification. And that court looked at the difference between the total value of taxable property in the entire county. In smaller counties, there's less value. But under that holding, it probably points to the fact that why there probably hadn't been a subsequent
So
lawsuit.
the
I
issue
would
actually
guess.
came up in a published case.
Yes, that's
Okay.
You get the
well,
site.
I
You get the
think
site
that,
on
that
it.
answers the question.
Yeah, 27 Southwest 3rd, 790.
Senator Nemus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And JD, thank you very much for your informative, passionate presentation. And I'm going to ask you something that you can take as either a hardball or a softball question. You're not used to softball questions from
No,
me.
sir.
So, when you're talking about after annexation, that population and GDP has increased, is that because you annex population and GDP, or is that because after the annexation, the population and GDP increase? This is aside of the fair market value.
Senator, you're kind of buttressing Senator Wheeler's point there, which is, knowing the particular facts. I think it's probably the safest answer there is that it's a combination. In Columbus, they cite the fact that a lot of that growth was attributed by being able to annex the land. In some cases, you annex the land, you do have industrial development. It increases residence and population in other parts of the state or in other parts of the city. I'll say this: I really like Jim Henderson's, my counterpart at CAECO. I like his statement. It says, and he says this all the time: you've seen one Kentucky county, then you've seen one Kentucky county. 415 cities. You've seen one Kentucky city, you've seen one Kentucky city, and if you've seen one annexation, you've seen one annexation. Even in our little smaller state than a lot of the places we looked at. So I think it's probably a combination. But what they have is goes to that first point, that cities that cannot make those changes and evolve end up on average having worse municipal bond ratings, lower or higher poverty levels, less well-educated workforces, because the city's got to continue to grow. Typically in a city government situation, and this is rational human behavior, Senator.
Okay.
You got the city boundary.
That's good. You
and it
answered the
grows-
question.
It grows outside of it.
Thank you,
Okay.
JD. So you took that as a fast pitch softball.
I did.
discussion.
Okay. All right. As long as I hit it, sir.
Okay, Representative Chester Burton.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here today, JD. I mean, that was a great presentation. What I'm thinking about is when I was mayor of the city of Shively, while we did not do any annexations ourselves, but I talked to a lot of other cities that did and what the investment that occurred within that city. So can you just talk a little bit about, and yeah, you might have touched on it, but talk a little bit about what type of investment cities make and the type of services that they provide when they annex.
Thank you, Representative. It's hard not to call you Mayor, but thank you, Representative Chester Burton. I think the most obvious and the ones that we had in the presentation was utility investment. But a lot of these annexations, when they occur, especially if it's industrial or manufacturing, the city ends up having to incentivize the development, not the annexation, but the development, especially if it involves the cabinet for economic development with the state. In most cases, you'll see the city incent by use of their property tax revenue or anticipated property tax revenue the development by participating in KBI, pledging 1% of their occupational taxes. They may abate property taxes for a 5-year period, which is allowed under statute in Kentucky's Constitution. They may use the other percentage or insurance premium taxes or pay for the cost, as in the case of Richmond, $100 million to invest utility infrastructure to facilitate that development. And after it's done, it's sometimes 10 or 20 years before the city starts making it. It's not like we annex and revenue starts falling like manna from the sky. There are so many times that we have to make an investment and pledge that revenue that it might be 10 or 20 years before we even think about starting seeing revenue in the amount to pay us back. But what we've done for the community, for the state, for the region, is create jobs and create opportunity for our people. And we think those investments are worthwhile. So I appreciate that question. That there is a lot of participation with pledging a tax revenue in order to help developments prosper.
And a follow-up.
Sure.
The other thing I want you to talk about is the fire districts within that. What does that look like?
Fire districts.
Yes. Because Jefferson County has plenty of those. So what
Oh.
happens with the fire district when they annex?
So, Kentucky's fire districts, we did I was able to participate with then Representative David Floyd. I think he's now the chief of staff for the Republican caucus. When he was in the minority, we ended up drafting a bill and passing a bill that dealt with fire districts when cities annex. Representative, and it provides as those fire districts rely on property taxes. If a city annexes that has a regular fire department, they're able to choose whether or not the city has a primary right to take over fire services. Usually, the property owners want the city to because it has a lower ISO rating, and it's going to charge them less on their premium taxes. But if there's any indebtedness in that fire district before the city can take over, they have to pay back the fire districts the proportional share of indebtedness as a ratio of the total taxable property in the annexed area to the total taxable property in the fire district. So there's a formula. So there's a little bit of a precedent to talk about what I was talking about on the suggestion with regard to indebtedness. That's the way that works. It doesn't leave the fire district in a position where it can't continue to serve the rest of the area following the annexation. And that's a good precedent.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Wheeler has a follow-up.
JD, you and I met earlier in the week and discussed this some. I know I spoke a couple years ago, I think, at the Kentucky County Judge Executives Association conference and just was asking them, what their main issues were. And as you undoubtedly know, it was annexations and jail costs. Of course, there was one judge that raised the hand on jail costs, but he didn't raise his hand on annexation. And I didn't actually know Gary Moore at the time, but he introduced himself afterwards and said, he goes, "You notice I didn't raise my hand." He said, "Do you want to ask me why?" I'm like, "Well, I'm an inquisitive fella," so I said, "Yeah, why didn't you raise your hand?" And I guess he said they were under the 30,000 threshold at the time the statute was passed, and so basically he loses no revenue, so they've had a completely collaborative government as far as his cities and the county with annexations, and I guess they've had the largest population growth of any county in the Commonwealth of Kentucky in the last 30 plus years. Is there a reason why you don't feel a similar model could be effective in other regions?
That you're right on point with Judge Moore in Boone County. They'd actually enacted their occupational tax, I believe, prior to 1986, which kind of grandfathered them in. I mean, this is that statute. If you opened up 68 197 and looked at those provisions, it's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. I see how it's confusing. It's confusing to you all. It's confusing to us. They're grandfathered in because they did it prior to 1986, I think. I think our issue would be with retroactive stacking. I mean, what has happened with the development in the cities where they exist right now is those have been city-driven investments for the most part, and probably just to be completely frank about it, that's probably going to have a difficult path for passage. That would be millions of dollars of tax increases on our workers in our most urban areas. And it goes the opposite direction of the way that this legislature has been going with regard to reducing productivity-based taxes, with what you're doing with the income tax. So I don't know that it wouldn't work, but I think there are a lot of challenges to probably do that. And then looking at it, fairness from the taxpayer's
and I
perspective
don't know that
in the
anybody's
city.
talked about retrospective. I don't know that I could necessarily have buy-in to that, but conversations, at least I've heard of, have been of a prospective nature.
Well, I think that Senator Wheeler was embodied in one of the suggestions with talking about how to do that stacking on annexations going forward if we have some cost sharing model. I think we're anxious to explore that with our county counterparts on annexations going forward. I think that model could be very workable, and so do our members.
Representative Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to get back to the the bill that formed this task force, and I've just got some questions. I'm just wanting to see the progress since the moratorium. How many annexations have taken place?
Well, Representative Bridges, I don't think it was a moratorium. I think what we ended up enacting was a piece of legislation that required some notification prior to completing the annexation.
Actually, it stopped annexation unless you had both parties work together and it was agreeable by all parties.
No, sir.
So,
No, sir, it did not stop annexation. It did not. We had to provide notice. We had to provide notice, 45-day notice, if there's property owner consent, and the annexation, if we provided the notice, was able to proceed, unless it involved the annexation of a school district. That was an exception to the rule. There were several exceptions to the rule, but it did not stop annexation. And there have been multiple annexations that have occurred under the provisions of that bill, and that's why, with the changes that were ultimately made that passed when it passed the committee, we withdrew our objections to the bill because it did not halt Kentucky's growth. So there's been several annexations since the legislation was amended on to KLC's bill. Several of them have occurred under that exception where you have property owners' consents, but our cities have been complying diligently with providing notice to the county governments. So,
and how's that win? I'm not here to argue.
It seems like it's gone pretty well. A lot of the counties, in fact, which kind of goes to the point about cities and counties getting along, they've kind of gone ahead and enacted ordinances or enacted resolutions saying, thumbs up, city, keep going. They realize it helps them. So that's been a nice exercise under that bill when you see that the counties are actually supporting it. Even though they don't have to take any action, they're enacting resolutions encouraging their cities to go forward.
Okay. Follow up? Okay. A couple other things. One, the fire districts. I understand what you were talking about and everything. But what happens to those areas that are left inside the city limits away from a volunteer fire department where there's not a feasibility to provide one? Who covers those areas as far as fire protection and things of that nature that is outside a reasonable distance?
I wish I could remember the it's in Chapter 75 of the revised statute, but what that does is set up a choice factor for city governments. If you have a regular fire department, then the city's able to say we're going to take it over. They don't have to, but we're going to take it over. And what that does is when it goes inside the city limits, the city provides all the fire services if they provide that reimbursement to the fire district.
I understand that, but what about the areas that are not annexed into the cities?
That continues.
Does that go into that, or does that continue to be a volunteer fire?
It continues to be a fire district with the tax base that remained, plus the money paid by the city for taking over fire service.
I understand that, but what I'm seeing and what I'm getting some calls about and everything, they're so far inside the city, and it's not large enough to support the fire district or and everything, and it's becoming a problem. So
talking about islands.
Yes.
Islands.
And
We've talked about that a few times. Again, sometimes islands are created in city just because of the way the law is written that puts so much priority with the property owner rights. And in those cases, a few states you saw didn't have those little enclaves in cities from some of the other states. Those states have enacted statutes that just allow a non-voluntary annexation if it's completely surrounded by the city at the time the bill was passed. So there's several states that have, but that kind of travels away from our tradition here in Kentucky of putting the property owners' rights. I'll tell you what happens in most cases, and you can poll the city officials here. There's no real moral dilemmas. I mean, if a fire starts and it's in an island in the city, they're not going to go sit at the city limit boundary and watch it burn. They have mutual aid agreements. They're there. They put the fires out. They'll respond in police services. They're getting all those services without contributing at all to the tax base of the city, even though they're getting city services.
Okay. Well, okay. And then you said you've mentioned stacking several times.
Yeah.
But you said you're absolutely opposed to sharing.
No.
And
No.
You're not. I thought I heard
No
you say you were opposed.
No, Representative Bridges. What I said is that cities would be opposed to revenue sharing in the absence of cost sharing on newly annexed areas.
So you're not opposed to revenue sharing?
In instances, that's one of the proposals we made, right? That we would.
That's what I'm asking.
Yes.
You're here to testify, so I just want to make
Yes,
sure
sir.
I'm hearing it clear.
So
and
we
I
would
get the details.
we would want to explore the idea of allowing a stacking of that occupational tax in newly annexed areas if we had some sharing, but not just splitting, not just saying, oh, well, you're annexed, so you got to give half your revenue up, because most of that revenue is pledged in incentives, at least for the first 20 years. So if we can partner, if we can create a voluntary partnership where we can cost share, I think that that's something that we could explore. We're anxious to talk about that with their county counterparts.
Okay. I have to disagree on one thing.
Sure.
And you and I have talked about this, so this is, we'll get the elephant out of the room. You and I, I don't see. You've made this statement several times over the interim of asking permission. If you're going to work together, you got to find compromise. You've got to come to the table. It's not asking permission. It's called working together. And it's got to be agreeable to both sides, not only their side, but your side. So I just have and I've told you before, that's not asking for permission. If we're going to work together, we need to work together, and both sides. And I think that's what the legislation's wanting. We're not looking to solve a problem. We have come and asked KLC and KCO to sit down, bring us a solution so that we can actually go along and approve it. So just but in this, I've heard you repeatedly say, well, we're not going to in any circumstance ask their permission. When you work together, each other's, if you're going to do that, they've got to ask your permission too. So we just need to be careful. I just caution you in putting something out there in a way that I don't think, I know it's not the intent of the legislature to do that. And I know you've said you see it as, but we'll agree to disagree on that part. But we want to see KCO and KLC. I don't think there's a legislator serving right now that couldn't be happier. It's if we could put y'all in a room, y'all work something out, bring it to us, and we could all say, yes, let's go, let's move forward. That's what we're wanting. Now we're asking some hard questions, and but I don't see this being a grab for revenue. I mean, I could see the opposite side of it. It's a protecting revenue and, or potential stuff. So anyway, I just,
Representative, I just let my statements that are in the record now related to our desire to work together to solve the issue kind of stand for themselves.
okay. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, any other questions? Representative Meredith?
And we started this, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We started this conversation with a whole lot of discussion about Ronald Reagan. And I want to come back around to that a little bit. I am truly a child of the 80s, was born during the Reagan administration. And JD, you mentioned two different things. You mentioned Jim's conversation from the last time, and you mentioned the shining city on the hill too. And so going along with that trust but verify, you made a comment early in the presentation, and I want to go back to trust but verify. I've known you for nearly 2 decades now, and the only thing I've seen shining in here was your head today. And so, did you ever have hair to style like Ronald Reagan?
I'll have to bring you some pictures, Representative Meredith.
I have not even seen a picture
We
of
need
that.
we need to get to our question there.
I'm coming there.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, what I say is, and I think when you get to the resolution portion of the slides that you saw today, you will find the true difficulty in what this task force has been tasked with through the process. Because whether we're talking about the jail cost that is so overburdensome on counties, the pension cost that is burdensome to both cities and counties that we see today, the limited revenue options that have been allowed under the Constitution since 1891 or 1901 when it was amended, the 30,000 threshold that we've talked about throughout this process multiple times, none of the things that I have just named, which are the root cause and the heart of everything that brought us to where we are today, is the fault of a city or a county. It's the fault of something that has been done in a previous General Assembly or by a previous court ruling at the Kentucky Supreme Court level. And so what they have had to do, cities and counties have had to live within the means of everything that has been decided by the Kentucky General Assembly, by the voters of Kentucky through the Constitution, and by the Kentucky Supreme Court for decades, now going on a century or more, that have created the internal conflict between the two entities that we have had before us throughout this entire process of this task force. And I have had a lot of conversations during this process and prior with them about where we need to get to and how do we get there. And I see a strong willingness in both organizations to get to a resolution to what is really a family problem, so that we, as the General Assembly, don't have to intervene again to create another conflict 30, 40, 50 years down the road for the two organizations. And so what I would say is, and I'll finish it with a Ronald Reagan quote again, by working together, pooling our resources, and building on our strengths, we can accomplish great things. And so my charge is to both the leaders of the Kentucky League of Cities and to the Kentucky Association of Counties to heed those words from the former president and help us find a solution that is workable for both organizations, for cities and counties of all stripes around the Commonwealth, so that when we come back into session, we don't have a battle on our hands. We get to all come back together to work for the betterment of the entire Commonwealth and the betterment of our individual communities. And so I think that is the charge that we have for each of you all as we move forward. We'll have at least one more month of task force meetings, maybe two. But I know that there's a lot of discussions that need to be had between the organizations as well. And I trust, because of my relationship with both organizations, that the folks that are leading those organizations will work in good faith to make sure that that happens. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? Co-Chair Dick.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to take the opportunity, if it is the last task force that we do have before facts and findings, to just take this opportunity to KCO and KLC, all mayors, all judges, and all involved. Senator Meredith put it best, but felt from a chair position I needed to say it has been a very productive. Everyone has had a very open mind. Everyone has communicated well. We applaud those efforts. Hope that that continues. Representative Meredith gave you an upgrade there.
I'll call the question on that, Mr. Chairman.
But Representative Meredith brought up a great point that we have seen a lot of collaboration. We truly appreciate it. It is a problem decades old. It is something we are tasked with and sifting through. And so I just wanted to, as the chair, co-chair of this committee, just let you know that the efforts that have been put forth have been seen, have been heard. We truly appreciate it, and we hope that continues all into session, and we continue to work forward for the betterment of our Commonwealth.
Well, very good. Our November 17th is our next meeting. And members of the committee, if you want to share information or ideas with other members on the committee, I suggest sending emails if you have something that's caught your attention today. I do want to thank our audience. This is an unusually large Friday afternoon audience, and a lot of them have city stickers on. I know there's a few county people out there too. So, but thank you so much for being here and being respectful. JD gave a great presentation and gave us something to think about over the next several weeks as well. So I would like to mention that the good-looking young guy over there on the left over here, on my left by the door, is my youngest son. So he just popped in. So y'all could welcome him. All right, we stand adjourned. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you.